Hi, and welcome to an episode of the Jet Rails podcast. I'm Robert Rand, your host, and I'm joined by a member of one of our partner agencies, Gage. I've got Robert Floyd here with me today. Robert, would you do us the honor of introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Robert Floyd. I am the art director and lead designer at Gage. Been there for about 4.5 years now.
Yeah, and so today we're going to be discussing web design and branding for Magento sites, talking about best practices and how to get the job done right. Maybe a few things that have been learned along the way.
Yep,
uh,
absolutely.
yeah. I think that's how, that's part of the beauty of the industry that we're both
Hmm.
in, is that it's constantly evolving, and no one really went to school to learn how to build a Magento site. There's some folks that have, but by and large,
Right,
most of the veterans in the industry picked up a lot of what they know, at least,
hmm,
school of hard knocks, that
that's
constantly
right.
new versions, new developments.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'll start us off. When you're diving into a project, what's the first design asset that you like to get created for a merchant? Where do you like to start the process when someone new is coming in?
Yeah. So usually where we start is, if a merchant comes to us and they say, we have a logo, we have brand assets, the typography, colors, imagery, all that stuff is really great. And some merchants come to us and they have that, some don't. And so it's just kind of dependent on where they are in their kind of organizational life cycle, whether or not they have that documentation. Obviously all of them have at least a logo, so we can come in and kind of start beginning to make some assumptions around that. However, for us, usually one of the first places we start is actually not necessarily with like a design asset, like something that we actually, kind of put out as a deliverable. It's usually more around like a customer persona, doing customer interviews, kind of doing some really light user testing on a current site to kind of get some idea around, who are your customers? Why are they coming to you? What are they looking to get from this site? What are the products that they're looking for? Who else might they be going to and talking to? Even just like where else are they shopping? Many of our clients sell things that you can buy on Amazon. So it's like, why are they coming to this site in particular? What are they getting out of this? And so we'll often start kind of in a fairly heavy kind of research phase with our clients in order to really kind of get an idea of, okay, where are we going? What do we need to do to make you competitive in the market? Obviously the platform choice is really important for that. But even more so the front end experience that you're giving a customer and getting the research, competitive analysis, all of that, to really kind of help them or help us and the client understand, okay, here's where we need to go with the design. Here's what we need to make. Here's how we need to make it. Instead of just kind of diving straight into making design, we have to kind of come up with some strategy and some ideas about, okay, what do we need to do and how do we need to do it and why? So that's usually where we start for the most part.
That's fantastic. So basically, you want to know, what are the demographics that you're speaking to? What's the
Yep.
shopping journey going to look like?
Hmm.
You're really catering to the shopper more than just creating something snazzy. That's fantastic. And
Correct. Yep.
are there cases where they come to you and you see maybe as you go into this process, you see the logo, you see the style guide, the brand assets, and you say, we really think this, before you invest into the entire web design and some of these other things, that it might be time for a brand refresh, or perhaps that may not speak as well to the market as one would
Hmm.
want?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sure, it absolutely has happened several times for us. It often, depending on the timeline and kind of some other exterior kind of business goals, sometimes it is feasible to redesign a logo. Sometimes it's not. We often will suggest, hey, maybe there's an agency you can go and work with, in order to like really focus on branding and marketing, like that really in-depth, brand process can be, of course, its own very large and lengthy project, depending on what it is and how it goes. So it certainly has been something that we have suggested, and certainly something we've done in the past, if the timing is right. We often find that a lot of times you don't even necessarily need to redesign the logo so much as you just need to say, how does all of the elements on the site and everything that you're putting out, how can that support your logo? Because oftentimes, many of our clients come to us, they have, 10, 15 years of, equity built up basically within their logo, within their image. And so maybe it's even just as simple as refreshing color and fonts, layouts on the site in order to give it a really, cleaner, more kind of up-to-date look and feel. And also a lot of that can even depend on, how do you want to communicate? So like if a client comes to us and they say, hey, we're really trying to be a serious kind of, I don't know, kind of high-end brand, and they're kind of using these really bright, kind of crazy RGB colors, we might be going, okay, well, we probably need to take a look at that. We need to make sure that we're really representing the things that you want to say and the things that you want to be to your customers and to the audience that you're trying to get to. So it absolutely has happened where we've kind of helped them kind of refresh or rethink, but it doesn't always require a total 100% overhaul of everything. Sometimes it can just be as simple as updating type and colors in your style guide and your standards to really make it something that is a little bit fresher and looks, maybe not like it's made in 1996 or something.
With that in mind, is there, psychology-wise, do you find that it's important to look at things like what color add to cart buttons are, getting down into, a little into the nitty-gritty there? But
absolutely,
do you find that more than just the color scheme of the site itself, that using different elements in different parts of the site are going to have a major impact?
Absolutely. And that's usually, where we'll go in with a style guide or style tiles is what we'll start with, and kind of dream a little bit about what the color is going to be. How is these colors going to impact, if we're going to use all these bright colors, how are we going to ensure that your add to cart button is obvious, that it's usable. You also get into things like ADA accessibility in terms of, your color choice and making sure that it's legible and readable to people, no matter, if they have a vision deficiency, if they use a screen reader or whatever those types of,
people don't realize things like you want certain contrast between colors to make it more ADA, accessible. And, it's interesting that Domino's was just denied a court case, where they were trying to get away from certain ADA needs. It's always great to hear an agency that is trying to advise clients and merchants on best practice to avoid those sorts of situations. Do you find that there are other major areas that you like to touch on around that specifically, other than maybe, color schemes and contrasts?
Well, I think, a lot of it from a design perspective, of course, is color scheme. A lot of it is font size. So, actually making sure that, you're using legible font sizes, especially on, a mobile device versus the tablet versus a desktop computer. Even getting into things like link indicators, button indicators, a lot of it is even just around, ensuring that this thing, that I understand what this element is going to do when I click it, when I interact with it, if I can interact with it. Of course, there's a lot that we do on the development side as well, and ensuring that forms are structured appropriately. Using alt text for images. All that kind of stuff is stuff that we do really heavily, and oftentimes is something that can be overlooked, but is very, very important. As you just mentioned, with Domino's, many companies are really getting into the point where it's like, hey, you do need to be paying attention to this, because there is a subsect of the population that needs it and that requires it in order to shop. Yep. Absolutely.
That these are real people that want to be on your site and shopping and interacting as well. And, I find there are other benefits, like, having proper alternative tags, proper alt tags for images can help your SEO efforts. So it's not necessarily that it's an all or nothing when it comes to how you're investing into this, that you're getting more bang for your buck than just just the one thing maybe that you're thinking of, but following best practice can often lead to a lot of benefit. And search engines and other systems, that they're evolving to look at lots of things, whether it's mobile usability or things that are going to relate, that are going to bring value. So I often find being ahead of the curve is a good thing. It means that
Absolutely.
as their algorithm updates and other things, that you're going to benefit from it,
Yes.
while others are still trying to catch up. So pulling it back a little bit, you start off, folks go from maybe the sales team into into your team, into production. You're collecting information. Maybe there's intake forms, there's kickoff meetings. You've had lots of communication before you ever get to a first draft. So that,
Correct.
I used to say in my agency days that if I was going to hand someone a first draft, there was no way that I was going to be able to make them happy if I didn't have an understanding before we started if they liked the equivalent of Art Deco or Old Victorians. How do you build someone a house and make them happy? What a waste of their time. So no, that's all great stuff. Do you ask them for sites that they like, for competitors' sites, or just general websites that they appreciate, to kind of get a taste for their interest? Does that usually work in your favor?
Yeah. So typically what we do is, we'll do a kind of a brand analysis. So, kind of going back a little bit to that branding conversation, is like, who do you want to be? Who are you talking to? How are you presenting yourself, and how do you want to present yourself? We often will say, like, if you could be a character from a movie, what would that be? Like if your brand was that, because it kind of gives us an idea about the personality and the imagery that we want to use, and kind of the way it needs to look and feel. So we'll use that a lot of times to kind of base around, okay, here are other companies that do something similar. So there's the kind of the idea of saying, okay, what are companies that you look up to, like kind of aspirational brands that you might look to? So, the popular ones are usually Apple or Nike or things like that. And they'll say, here's what we really like about them. But then we'll also kind of do our own research in terms of, okay, here are companies that are maybe in a similar space as you, doing something with a similar kind of customer base, but they're also kind of speaking and talking in a very similar way to what you want to do. And so we'll pull those websites, and we'll pull out very specific kind of aesthetic pieces, maybe features, maybe technical things that they've done that are really attractive and potentially something that they could do. So sometimes that's, use of imagery. Is it going to be full bleed? Are you going to do lots of just image grids? Are you going to use video backgrounds, video players? How are you going to do that? What kind of colors are you going to use? All that kind of stuff. And that's usually just like a mood board. Sometimes we'll put it up into like a kind of a presentation or a deck to kind of walk them through, like, okay, here are the things that we're looking at. Here's the things and why we think this might be really valuable for you, so that you can help make a decision around, here are some of the direction that we might go, and just kind of get that general idea of like, I really like what I see there. I don't like what I see there. I've seen that too much, so I don't really want to do that, things like that, and kind of beginning to gauge feedback. And kind of like you said, what resonates the most, and what maybe will we even have to work a little bit harder towards if we do feel like we maybe need to go in a slightly different direction, and talking and kind of the ideas and the reasons for some of those design decisions.
Absolutely. Well, there were a few years where I think the number one site that I would consistently be told people liked and wanted us to keep in mind when designing their site was Apple.
Yes. Yeah.
It was like, well, of course you love it. It's austere, because by the time you get to that website, you know everything you need to know about that company. You already have brand affinity. They don't need to convince you of anything. They don't need to sell you anything. That job has already been done.
Right.
So, it is interesting that sometimes what you can learn through the process, almost educating the consumer, in this case, the e-commerce website owners and managers, on what might be in their best interests. It's always great when you get someone that'll take the feedback, that will, that'll take the constructive critique on what they've asked and reshape it around some best practice and such. So that's good stuff. And do you like to start with wireframes, or go right into a full first draft, maybe with some, with some placeholders? But
right. Yeah. So normally, so we'll start with like the style tiles, like I was mentioning, which is normally a big artboard that's just full of ideas and form elements and navigation use and mobile navigation and all that kind of stuff. So it's really just an experimental playground, really, to kind of present a lot of different ideas. And at the same time, if we need to, if we have a specific feature or if we have a specific kind of, set of pages that we really need to pay close attention to, we will begin to wireframe, or at the very least do some user flows and sitemaps around some of those things. So even if we're not getting in and making like true gray box wireframes, we're beginning to determine structure. We're beginning to determine kind of here's how things need to flow and work, so that when we get to the place where we go, okay, now we can go ahead and start making those first drafts of the actual pages. It's easier to just apply things and say, well, we've already decided that we want our buttons to look like this. We've already decided we want our primary color to be this and our headings to look like this. Let's just put them on the page. And that helps us even get to like a point where we can even test some of the designs we're putting out a little bit faster, so that we can validate the decisions we're making and saying, yes, these things will work. This is going to resonate. This is going to be something people like to use. So typically it's like going through that kind of user flow, sitemap, and a little bit of wireframing. Obviously, we still do that gray box wireframing, and we'll kind of put it in front of our clients. Usually that's done like in a sketch and, presenting with InVision or something along those lines. If we need to kind of really kind of hone in, okay, here's how the structure is going to look. Here's how these features are going to work and things like that.
And you're getting sign-offs all through that process so that you keep moving forward and hopefully not backward.
That's right. Yeah. And it can be, that's one of the things that can be the unknown with design process, right? Is like getting in and saying, we put a lot of time and energy into this direction. And suddenly we don't like that anymore. And we have to kind of back up. And so we do kind of have to balance the idea of, we need to get sign-offs at every stage, but we also want to maintain some flexibility so that it doesn't feel like we're trapped with something we don't want to use or we don't like for the next 3 to 5 years or however long they're going to keep the site. And so it is kind of a balancing act to say, okay, we're basically lightly signing off on everything as we go through. And then kind of when we get to the end of the design process, we're saying, okay, this is what we're good with. We're good with this to build it and to get it up. And then we can continue to iterate post-launch and say like, launch day is really day zero for a site. And so we say, okay, now let's figure out how are we going to iterate? How are we going to make this thing better over time so we can continue to remain competitive and continue to make sure people are able to do the things they want to do when they come to our site.
Yeah. So in essence, keep it agile. So if if by the time the alterations are done on the wedding dress, the bride can't stand it, it's time to go back to the drawing board.
That's right. Yeah. In some ways, yeah, absolutely.
All makes sense for me. And these days, are you starting with, as you're creating layouts and designs, are you presenting the mobile layouts and designs first, desktop, both simultaneously? What's the average process?
Yeah, sure. So typically we'll, when we do a design presentation, we'll kind of put together a little deck to walk through any features or thoughts or ideas that we've had, and kind of saying, here's what we're going to talk about today. Here are the things that we're going to address. And in that process, when we get to actually presenting designs, we'll present usually a mobile and a desktop next to each other. Typically, I try to put the mobile on the left, so it's the first thing you look at, and kind of put that inside a mobile mockup. Again, usually using InVision. Kind of their browser app is really wonderful for presenting design and kind of looking at it and getting a feel. Okay, this is kind of how it might look in browser when we get there. So we'll typically do them side by side, kind of scrolling through. We'll typically say, hey, here's how it's going to work on mobile. And then, when we get to desktop, it's saying, here's how things change. Here's how things are different. Here's why those things are there. We can add things like hover states on desktop, which we can't do on mobile. There are certain things around, even like, how you scroll and the kind of the fold on mobile versus desktop. So there's a lot of considerations that we have to make. And usually we talk about those things with like a product page and a category page and homepage. Those are usually the three main pages that are like, these are the things that we really need to get right, since they are the bulk, obviously, of the site. So product page is usually the one that takes the longest, just because there's so much potential information, so many decisions that have to be made in terms of, what do you put first on the page, a heading, product title, image, breadcrumb navigation, all that kind of stuff. And so we'll walk through all of those decisions with our clients, in the presentation. So they really have a clear idea of, okay, here's why these things are in the places they are. But again, yeah, kind of the idea of like you look at mobile first and then you kind of progressively enhance to desktop so that you're really providing a great experience between the two.
Well, and it's interesting that there was a time when the home page was absolutely the most important page in a site. Depending on your marketing campaigns today, for instance, if you're running product display ads, Google Shopping ads, you're driving people right to the product pages, regardless that whether those people ever see your homepage might be questionable.
Exactly.
So,
yep, absolutely.
I'm with you that if you don't have enough optimization for conversion rates and other purposes on the product page level, you're not in great shape. That there's a ton of important information to be thought through there. Do you typically start with the homepage design, and then basically once you have some of those elements together and headers and footers and what have you, that you take those and use those for the category and the product page layouts and keep moving forward in that direction?
No, actually, usually we go the reverse. So, I mean, there's obviously arguments to be made for either one, but we like to go product page, category page, homepage, just because we do feel like there's so much of the meat of your site that is contained on a product page in terms of content, the product story, different types of imagery or media that have to be considered. And of course, how all the global elements like buttons and navigation, drop downs, form fields, all that kind of stuff plays into that area. And so by the time we've done usually product page and category page, those two things, usually the home page is really just a matter of which content and what order. The design of it is usually pretty much we can kind of inherit from the other two pages in terms of, here's what a big, section might look like, or a slider, product cards, reviews, if those types of things are there. And usually it's more around, here's what the content strategy for the page is. Here's what someone needs to see when they get here first. Here's the next thing they need to see, promotions, featured categories, new products, whatever that might be. Yeah. So usually we kind of go in that opposite, the different flow.
I've grappled with that as well, partly because the homepage, usually the content is less defined at the beginning of the project. Right. So it's much harder to show someone what a final homepage will look like. It's a lot easier to take a sample product and lay out the product page and get that approved and know the direction you're heading. So I like that a lot. And we don't see that quite as often. I think a lot of folks still start with the homepage.
And I think one of the things that it helps us with too is understanding the constraints. So, we don't necessarily use lorem ipsum, dummy text throughout the site. We're pulling the actual product names, the product descriptions. And so it helps us to understand, like, okay, we need to allot this amount of space for a super long product name, might be 40 or 50 characters long versus a product name that might be 10 characters long. So we don't get, further on down the process and realize, oh man, like half these product names don't fit in what we've created. So we have to back up and rethink some of the system, when in reality, we've already kind of taken into consideration a lot of those different ideas or needs. And then we can kind of progressively go throughout the rest of the site to make sure that we're considering all those things.
Yeah. And with that in mind, how do you handle the features and functionality themselves? I know with a site like a Magento site that there's a lot, and I mean a lot off the shelf that you can choose to use or not. And that could be small buttons and things like wish lists and, and comparison between products on a category or other, search results page or such, that there's a lot that you can do that you can enable and disable. There are, not quite infinite Magento extensions and add-ons, but certainly a lot. Do you try to have that locked down in terms of what the development side of the house is going to be doing first, so that when you're providing a layout of the product page, that if it's going to have, store locator features or, all these other things involved, that you've got that already allowed in the layout?
Yeah. So I would say about, solid 60 to 70% of the time, we have a lot of those technical needs and kind of scope defined before we're getting into the design process. And so we're able to go in and say, yes, we're going to do a store locator, or we're going to use a custom search extension to empower, synonym search or visual search or whatever that might be. So we're able to go in and have some of those conversations. And of course, during the process, when things may come up, from customer interviews or customer testing, some of the greatest innovation can come there, but that can also create a lot of uncertainty in terms of a project, timeline. If suddenly customers are asking for this crazy product finder that we didn't scope, well, that can create some, uncertainty in the project budget, project timeline, et cetera. And so we'll definitely be having conversations with our development team as we're creating pages, as we're kind of considering, different types of interaction, patterns or design needs and things like that. We'll be having conversations with them pretty much simultaneously to make sure that we are not building something that's out of scope, but that we are also making sure that, the technical needs are going to be able to be met in a way that's, of course, friendly for the merchant and usable for the customer as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, from the development standpoint, it's wonderful to be agile. And it's great to be able to, move on the fly and not just to say, well, that's the project. And so, it's a 3-month project. And in the end, you wanted things that we're not going to give you, because you're trying to add them at the 11th hour.
Right.
But when you add them at the 11th hour, then you need to retest everything. Now this new extension conflicts with others, that it's not just the labor to add it, but now you're going back through QA and all sorts of things and all sorts of implication. I'm with you. You got to rip up certain things.
Yep, absolutely.
So it's ups and downs the entire process. That it's, I think, for someone that hasn't been involved in one of these projects before, it's always a bit difficult to understand that. It's almost, I always like giving people a bit of a risk analysis when I could, to say, look, these are the things that could delay the project. These are the things that could cause it to go outside budget. And no one wants to hear that, but I found that the good clients, that they liked having that conversation because they would rather have that conversation in advance.
Oh, sure. Right. Yeah, and I think a lot of them will appreciate the honesty and transparency about what something takes as well.
Exactly. A lot of people won't have the conversation, and then that says something as well. So
absolutely.
So as you're going through this process now, let's say we've got our product page, our category page, our home page. Do you lay out a few more layouts, like for a CMS template? For other things, is it case by case? Do you basically just have the developers use some CSS to style some of the default pages, like a login page? How in depth does it get? Is it really a case by case?
Yeah, so sometimes it does depend a little bit on the project and what other kinds of pages might need to be styled. We have done it before where we've styled literally like every template that exists, which is a lot of work and a lot of different pages, especially when you consider that you need a desktop and a mobile for each one, and that basically doubles the number. So we have begun to move more into what we call the atomic design method of establishing essentially global styles that are reusable across all pages. And so when you establish, your grid width, your heading 1, your heading 2, your button styles, that right there can account for a pretty good chunk of the Magento, the customer admin section, your account pages, your shipping pages, your order pages, all that kind of stuff. So, even just designing, the faceted navigation can often help establish the style for, the side navigation in that part of the website. So, we kind of have gotten to a point where we can basically build out a more robust pattern library that pulls out one-off kind of, elements or needs that can then kind of become the final or the kind of this foundational piece for our development team so that they can style everything. And then all they have to do is arrange elements on the page and reuse things. And, that's not usually something that clients will see. Normally we're doing that in the background. That's kind of a final, like make sure all the details are wrapped up and all the little elements are there. but it's certainly helpful to ensure a smooth handoff, which, does kind of, if it's not a smooth handoff, it can come back to bite you, later on in QA and testing when things don't look right or things aren't styled properly or things aren't working properly. You're like, well, what happened is like, well, there may not have been a great handoff there. And so the more the design team, or our design team specifically, can set up our development team to understand and see kind of the whole system and why and how it works, the more successful that the development implementation will be, but also the less pages you have to design of all those extraneous, account and wish list and all those other pages that kind of live out there. Again, the kind of the exception to that being, if there are specific pages or specific features that a client is saying, we really want to be able to see this, we really want to know how this is going to work and why it's going to work that way, and we'll go ahead and mock those pages up if they need it.
And have you ever had a customer, or is this something that happens maybe a few times a year, that starts off with some of their own designs that brings you some of their own, PSDs or other, layouts or mockups to work from, and then you have to sort of translate that into something that'll work not only for the shopper, but perhaps more importantly with Magento, in order to keep a project in budget and reasonable and healthy?
Absolutely. Yeah. We actually just had a project like that this past year, where they had a lot of designs already finished, but a lot of it either was not, Magento friendly, so to speak, or even in some ways UX best practices around navigation and things like that. And so we were able to kind of come in and help and say, here's how we can make this better. We're not changing everything. We're not making this dramatic overhaul. We're just adjusting some elements, adding an icon here or there, adding some padding, whatever it might be, moving a button from, one place to another place to make it, saves, unlimited number of hours in development, which is just, you're like, why, how does that even work? And it's like, well, it's just the way the system is built. And so when you can do that, of course, it does definitely help on the process, but it's definitely something we've done. Obviously it's honestly a really good opportunity to increase, your UX best practice in that area. Because you're not necessarily focusing on all of the visuals. You're not necessarily focusing on like, here's exactly how it needs to look. You're able to say, here's how we can apply visuals to best practices, to research, to things that we know from the industry to help make it a really good user experience that is, of course, Magento friendly.
And I don't know when the last time you brought on a new designer was. So I don't know if it'll be an easy question, but
sure.
How long would you say it takes to get the prerequisite knowledge about what Magento does do off the shelf and what it doesn't, to be in a good place to provide logical designs that are going to make sense when they get to implementation? Is it 3 projects in and you start to get your feet under you? Is it, any thoughts there? It's a bit of a subjective question.
Yeah, it is a little bit, and it kind of depends on the designer as well. You do have designers who have different strengths in different areas. So our other designer actually is a very strong systems designer. Like, he loves getting in with the details and making sure all of the little things and the little kind of use cases are accounted for. And you have designers who are like that, who are just very, very I guess maybe like an architect type designer, like they're considering all the details. And when you have a designer like that, I find it's a little bit quicker and easier to get someone up to speed on the intricacies of the platform. Of course, our development team is really helpful. Our project management team is extremely knowledgeable in terms of, Magento's capabilities. Magento's docs have gotten a lot better in the last year or so. So like there's an entire section on like front end and like, here's how these things are structured and here's how these things work. And even just being able to look through that and say, I have a question about how this element might need to work, or how the faceted navigation works on the category page. Being able to go in and say, okay, here's exactly what is available, or being able to just drop a comp, screenshot your comp in Slack and say, hey, how would this work? Does this work? That kind of thing. I find that can be a lot more valuable of a process to have those types of conversations than necessarily saying, after 3 projects, you're definitely ready to go, or, 6 months in and you've, kind of done all this training, but more along the lines of kind of like the organic training and learning through just doing it and kind of having conversations with people who have been there.
Yeah. And, we've been talking the entire time about a new project, maybe a new site, building it on Magento for the first time, in essence, at least in my head. whether they're migrating from something else, or in which case maybe you'd certainly be looking at what they were doing in their historical site. I guess that's an interesting one. Always trying to, sometimes it's almost like you don't want to see what they have because you want to come to them with your best foot forward, not focused on what the old was, but thinking about the new. But you certainly, you want to keep maybe a little bit of that brand moving forward, not to lose all of it. But how different is it when you're looking at a project, maybe that's already on Magento, and that it's time for a new theme?
Yeah, so I think, in that process, one of the things that we can do, and kind of what I was alluding to a little bit earlier, is like being able to test the current site, being able to get in with a customer on a Zoom meeting or a GoToMeeting or Hangouts or whatever, and just say, try to do some of these tasks for me. I think that part of the process can be way more valuable than a lot of people realize, because then you can find the places where this is the most obvious area for improvement. Maybe it is, we just need to make some updates to our color palette to be more ADA friendly. Maybe it is, just essentially looking at UX best practices and finding some new technology to power search and, the filter navigation in order to make it easier for people to find what they're looking for, or restructuring some of the way the categories work. And so in that kind of process, you can be a little bit more, I guess, specific and direct with your improvements, instead of saying, we're going to overhaul everything or we're going to change everything. And so when you kind of have an existing site, it kind of gives a frame of reference and saying, like, yeah, we can do this. We can do it exactly like this, or we can try to rethink it if we want to. And I think there's a little bit more, you can be a little more specific, but there's also a little bit more flexibility in that way. It's to say, like, yeah, we can try something new, or we don't have to try something new, or we can make an incremental improvement. We are seeing more and more clients coming to us and saying, we want to like implement onto a new system. We're looking, right now the conversation is Magento 1 to Magento 2, with the support ending. And so it's like, we're not necessarily looking to overhaul our theme or overhaul everything, but we are looking to make some UX improvements in addition to getting on new technology that's going to last longer, UX improvements or technology improvements that can really just help to make things a little bit easier.
Sure. Well, and as PWA Studio evolves with Magento 2, I think we're going to see more and more of that process of designing, for progressive web apps for a different head, a different front to the site. So that a whole new challenges, good challenges, I think, better conversions, faster sites, a lot of good things that come out of it, but different.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
for sure.
So with that, I think we've done a pretty good job of talking about the process.
Absolutely.
Any final thoughts? Anything that you'd add to the conversation that we haven't touched on?
I mean, I think, like I've said, just like considering the customer, considering what they're needing, what they're looking for. We're now pushing so hard user testing to say, like, make sure this thing works when you get it out there, because, Magento works in a specific way, but there is a lot of flexibility within that to create a system that really caters to a customer, really kind of creating almost like part of your product line is the experience that you're providing to, your customer on the web. Just like, you're going into a big box retailer versus a different big box retailer. Those two stores are inherently different experiences, but it is part of the reason you go there. It's part of the reason you buy those products. In the same way, a website can be that. And I think Magento offers a lot of flexibility and a lot of ability and technical expertise to be able to facilitate a lot of those experiences. But getting in front of the customer, talking to them, saying, what are you looking for? Why are you looking to do these things, so that you can really kind of find the competitive advantage even within the design process.
Fantastic. Well, it's been really a pleasure having you on the podcast. I'm so glad that you were able to join today. Today, I suppose, was the Robert show.
It was, yes.
Dueling Roberts on our mics.
That's right.
So really, to our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. Follow us on social, where you can comment, share ideas and thoughts on this episode, or past episodes, or episodes that you'd love to hear in the future. We're on LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook at JetRails. You can reach us at jetrails.com. Please subscribe, and we look forward to bringing you some great content in future episodes in the coming weeks. Thanks, and happy selling.